and my father was an air traffic controller for 41 years before taking a position with Continental Airlines for the last 9 years of his career. As a child, on our birthdays, my father would lease a float plane, a plane that lands on water, and he would take us up individually on our birthdays for a flight over the Chesapeake Bay. It was quite a thrill. And my father would fly right at the Bay Bridge, and at the last minute, because of the type of aircraft it is, he would drop down, or at least seemed like the last minute to a 5-year-old, and under the bridge we would go. I suspect today, if he did that, he'd have F-15s on his wings and be shot down into the Chesapeake Bay, but this was the late 60s, early 70s. You know, as a pilot, my father was rated both in what they call VFR and IFR in his ratings as a pilot. He could fly both props and jet aircraft. A VFR pilot is known as visual flight rules, which are simply a set of regulations that an aircraft can operate in clear, visible conditions such as a sunny day or a clear day. VFR requires that the ceiling, from the ground to the bottom of the clouds, has to be 3,000 feet, and you have to have at least 5 miles of visibility ahead of you in the aircraft to be able to operate under a VFR flight rules. IFR, on the other hand, is instrument flight rules. It requires a ceiling of less than 1,000 feet above the ground and 3 miles of visibility. Part of the training to receive an IFR rating is to learn to fly blind. The way they do it is they put you in, you and the flight instructor in the plane, they put a hood over your head. You can only see down to the gauges. If you've ever been in a cockpit, you know the dashboard is quite high. For a 5-year-old, I couldn't see over it. It was very upsetting, but it's very high. Probably I couldn't see over it today. I didn't get much height, but you're blind. And then the flight instructor takes the plane and maneuvers it all over the place, so you lose total sense of your altitude and how you are, what your vertical position is. And then they tell you to start flying the plane by the altimeter and the instruments that are in front of you. The idea, of course, is that as you lose control, your body and your mind are telling you one thing about where you are in relation to the ground, and your gauges are telling you something else. The idea is to ignore what your mind and body are telling you and only trust in the gauges and fly the plane by the gauges. I found the following description of the IFR rating online. It's just 2-3 paragraphs. I'll read it to you. It says, the harder rating to obtain of these two, VFR and IFR, is the IFR rating. Similar to VFR, IFR is set to the rules governing the aircraft, flying the aircraft. Instrument meteorological conditions, IMC, is defined as a type of weather that is below the minimum standards that I told you about. It says, simply put, IFR flying means navigating the plane through rough weather conditions, heavy clouds, and under darkness of night. Leveraging cockpit instruments such as altimeters and GPS systems and vertical speed indicators. It may sound risky to fly by instruments, but once you've received the proper training, it goes on to say it actually improves your safety. Instrument training also includes learning to read weather systems and reports, understand icing conditions, and how the human body responds to spatial disorientation. While instrument flying may involve a higher degree of precision and professionalism than VFR, earning this instrument rating means that you won't be grounded as often in bad weather, plus it's an essential component to advancing your skills as a pilot, so this description went. Within this description, it mentioned this idea of spatial disorientation, which can be catastrophic to a pilot. I'll quickly explain spatial disorientation for you. It's a state characterized as an erroneous sense of position, altitude, or motion of oneself and one's aircraft in relations to a fixed three-dimensional coordinated system defined by the surface of the Earth and the gravitational vertical. In addition, this also includes errors of perception by aviators of his position or her position, altitude or motion with respect to his aircraft and or his aircraft to other aircrafts. In layman's term, spatial disorientation is when your mind and body are telling you the airplane is flying flat like this, while all the time you're doing this and you're going down. You do not realize you are plummeting to the earth. Your body and your mind tell you you're flying flat. Today, I'd like to look at this spatial disorientation, but in a different way, spiritual spatial disorientation. I'd like to redefine it in those terms using this phenomenon that happens to pilots, which I loosely define spatial spiritual disorientation as being in this world, seeing and being told one thing, and all the while knowing something else. Your IFR, your instrument right flight training, or in our case, our spiritual flight rules, are telling you something totally different than what you are feeling and seeing in the society around you. The results can be catastrophic. I've said to my children many times that it is hard for me to express to them the world I grew up in, because even though the distance between myself and my oldest son is only 30 years, their world is so different. The world they came into is so different than the world I came into. And so it will be if they ever get about the job of giving us grandchildren. Just saying. Those children will have a different, completely different world than they do. When I was a child, it seemed to me that everyone was in some way living by a set of spiritual flight rules. And today, it feels to me like everybody is flying by the seat of their pants, resulting in spiritual spatial disorientation. Now, I was talking to my buddy Greg Rothwell last week about this idea, because when I was a young man, I lived on the right coast, and he lived on the left coast. R for righteousness, well, we'll leave the L out. Loser. So, I was going to leave it out. But where I grew up outside of D.C., everybody I knew went to church. They either went to a Catholic church, they went to a Protestant church, they went to a synagogue. Everybody went somewhere. Everyone had some sense of spiritual flight rules. We all knew there was a moral law. And today, as I said, it just seems like the generations around us have completely lost that altogether. They are flying by the seat of their pants, by what they feel or want to feel and what they see. In the field of aviation, this spatial disorientation is described in three ways. And I'm going to use these three today to elevate or to at least make my point of how we need to navigate this world that we are living in. Type 1 is what is known as unrecognized SD, or spatial disorientation. Unrecognized spatial disorientation. Here, the pilot gets disoriented, but doesn't realize he's disoriented or she is disoriented. In turn, leading to incorrect or inadequate decisions, tragically resulting in an accident. That's unrecognized SD. Then there is recognized SD, or spatial disorientation. It's here that the pilot recognizes that he becomes disoriented and takes corrective action and overcomes the disorientation. And then there's a third type of disorientation. It's incapacitating SD, incapacitating spatial disorientation. It's here, like with type 2, that the pilot recognizes that he is disoriented. But for reasons of incapacitation, he's unable to take corrective actions. That incapacitation, they say, may be psychological, physiological, or physical in nature, preventing the pilot from fixing what he knows is wrong and leading to a crash. Let's look at these three types to see how we can recognize the danger of spiritual spatial disorientation in the world we live in as we navigate through this dark and turbulent current age that we are living through today. Recently, I was asked to speak on the topic of navigating Satan's world by my buddy Kay Cribbs. I mean, I wasn't really asked, I was nagged, to be truthful about the way it worked. And I prayed more than 3 times, but it's just not going away. So Kay said this would be a great topic. And I said, we already have the list. You got 10 commandments. What else do you need? You've got the do's and don'ts. Just follow the rules. That's not what she was talking about, and I know. But the real issue is not the rules. We all know them and we apply them in this world we live in, this dark and turbulent world, like a pilot flying through the sky. What we need to recognize is while we're flying, we can become disoriented. We know the rules, we know to follow the gauges, we know all the things that pilots have been taught, and yet we can become disoriented. Remember, type 1 is unrecognized spatial disorientation. It's when a pilot gets disoriented but doesn't recognize it, makes incorrect decisions on how to fly the plane, and tragically, there is an accident. That's exactly what happened to John Kennedy. He took off on a very clear evening out of Teterboro, New Jersey, heading to his home on Martha's Vineyard in Massachusetts, which is an island out in the Atlantic Ocean. As he approached Martha's Vineyard, it became dark. Before he left, he read all the charts. He knew there was a storm coming in. He knew he'd be landing in the dark. He was trained right here in Florida, actually, and he was an IFR pilot. So he knew what to do. But as he approached, as I said, it had gotten dark and storm clouds had developed. These two factors would prevent John from making a visual approach onto Martha's Vineyard. He couldn't see the lights of the island. He's over the ocean. It's completely dark. He became spatially disoriented. They know from the recordings that he believed he was flying flat to the ocean at altitude. The whole time he was plummeting straight down to the ocean with his wife and his sister-in-law with him. It's hard to believe, isn't it? I mean, if you've been on a roller coaster or you've flown in an airplane and you've had an altitude drop, or you can feel the descent of an airplane when it's making a natural descent, if you've ever had a real altitude drop, you feel it. It's hard to believe that his mind and body were so convinced that he was flying at a level altitude, and the whole time he was plummeting towards the ocean, where he would hit, and his wife and he and his sister-in-law would die on impact. That's what spatial disorientation does to a pilot. When it comes to spiritual spatial disorientation, we're left with many examples in the scriptures that make you scratch your head. Mr. McTiernan spoke a week or two ago on King Asa. It's just hard to believe that he started out on level altitude and then he plummets at the end of his kingship to the ground. He had spatially disoriented. How about King David? Willie spoke on King David on the matter of Uriah the Hittite and the numbering of the children of Israel. Same thing. How did this happen to David? He thought he was flying at a level altitude the whole time. Meanwhile, he was plummeting to the ground, spiritually speaking. King Solomon was granted all the wisdom that anyone could have. No reason for him not to know to read the instruments. And yet, he spent a lifetime losing altitude. One of my favorites, someday I would like to speak on this, is King Jeroboam. I will never understand this. He was offered the same flight path that David was given, that his family would exist forever, that he would be set up in the same kind of royal way that David was. And he said, no, that's not the way I'm going to fly. He went a different way. The list goes on and on of examples of spiritual, spatial disorientation. But today I'd like to explore one in particular. In many ways, the person I'd like to talk about today, I believe his world and his life we can relate to our current world and our current life, even though they're about 4,000 years separated or 3,500 years separated. Today, I would like to look at the 12 hours of Lot in Sodom and Gomorrah. I think before we begin his story, I think as Mr. Johnson, who teaches the FI class on modern church history, he likes to teach the students first. He asks them, where is Waldo? So what does that mean? If you were born after 1987, which I suspect most of us were, you would know there were a series of books, or you may know there was a series of books that started by this Martin Hanford. And they were pictures. It's a pretty big book, and you could flip them, and each picture was 2 pages wide, and there's hundreds of individuals on there. And they could be building the pyramids, as an example, and you had to find Waldo. Waldo always had a red and white striped shirt and these round glasses. Very hard to find, oddly, among all these people. And that was the point, where's Waldo? It started out as Where's Wally in England, but when they came to the U.S. with it, they correctly gave it a better name, Waldo. So the idea, of course, when Mr. Johnson's teaching the class, is before we can look back at modern church history and look back at the 40s, the 50s, the 30s, the 60s, and the decisions that were made in the church, we have to first understand where were those people? What was their mindset? What was the world like they were living in? What was governing their lives? Where was Waldo? How did they navigate the world that they lived in? And I think we ought to set that stage for Lot before we start looking at this story. So what was the time frame of Lot? If I did the math right, the Abrahamic covenant was at around 450 years post the flood. You could add 20 years to that. I'm just making up the 20. Somewhere between that and the birth of Isaac, we have this story of Sodom and Gomorrah. So 470 years, roughly, after the flood, not far removed from the minds of the people who were living at that time. We still remember the Black Plague as a society pretty clearly, and particularly in this last pandemic we had. And that was in the 1300s, if I remember correctly. So here, they're only 470 years removed. And one of the people still alive is Shem. He came through the flood. He's still alive. He'll live until Abraham's 125 years old. So there are people, and people lived a long time, as we know. So there are people that really, maybe not Shem as first person, but other people that were very close. So this idea, I'm not planning on going as far into the story of Lot as the point where he has relations with his daughters. But if you think about the Where's Waldo, given what we see in chapter 19 with his daughters, and they say there will be no males left alive, I think it supports this idea that they were aware of the flood, that they understood that God at once destroyed all human beings, and possibly that is what they just saw with the destruction of that whole plain that Sodom and Gomorrah is in. It's important also to consider how quickly, post the flood, that the people have so totally rejected God and the level of depravity which is taking place, at least in this valley. Like I tell my kids, you cannot appreciate the world I grew up in, because we too are living in a time of accelerated depravity. The time I was born to the time we're in today, it is mind-boggling, the things that have happened. I can't express that to them because they didn't experience the before. But just watching what's happened in this 59 and a half years that I've been at this, no, Greg, I'm not going to 60. 59 and a half years, it's amazing to me. Let's begin, though, before we go into the story, let's make sure we put back who Lot is. Turn with me to 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 7. Because we're going to see Lot experience all three spatial disorientations, and there are some questions as to why he said and did some of the things he did, but Lot was a righteous man. It says here in verse 7, and delivered righteous Lot, who was oppressed by the filthy conduct of the wicked. For that righteous man, dwelling among them, tormented his righteous soul from day to day by seeing and hearing their lawless deeds. Here we can see that Lot was like us. He is navigating a world not far removed from this current dark and turbulent world that we are navigating. Following the analogy, we'll see that, as I said, that Lot is going to go through this experience. We're going to see where he applies all three space. He gets disoriented, and all three types he will go through in 12 hours. Turn with me to Genesis chapter 19, where we find the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. And remember, we're looking at this to say, how are we navigating our world? We live in a world like this. How did Lot navigate his times? He lived in turbulent times. How do we correctly navigate ours? It says, in verse 1, it says, now the two angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gate. Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them, and he bowed himself with his face towards the ground. And he said, hear now, my lords, please turn into your servant's house and spend the night. Wash your feet, and then you may rise early and go on your way. And they said, no, but we will spend the night in the open square. But he insisted strongly. So they turned into him and entered his house, and then he made a feast and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. It is here that we see the type 2 spatial disorientation. Remember, type 2 is recognized. He recognizes something here, that this world is disoriented, and like the pilot, he knows he has to take corrective action. I believe we can read into this that Lot understood the world he was living in and what would happen to those men if they had stayed in the square. And he took immediate corrective actions to protect these men that we know today are angels. You have to ask yourself, why did Lot not leave Sodom if he recognized how evil this city was? Why was he still there in the first place, in this wicked city? That may not be a fair question to ask. After all, where is Waldo? Consider this is his world, and he's living his life just as we are ours. We are all living in a place where there are all kinds of crime and depravity. Will someday people look back and ask us, why did you stay in cities that were so filthy and all these things going on? Why didn't you move to the middle of Montana or Nebraska and escape the depravation that's going on in the world we're in? Well, first of all, it's cold in those places, but, maybe for the summer. It was his world, and he was navigating through it, as it says, as a righteous man, just as we are navigating through ours. And it is here that we see what we read in 2 Peter. He was oppressed by the filthy conduct of the wicked. In type 2, spatial or spiritual disorientation, in the case of a pilot, spatial disorientation, they recognize what they're seeing is not correct, that what's going on before them, what they're feeling and what they're seeing is not correct, and they focus in, they bend their mind, they bend their will to look at their navigational tools. As we look at navigating our way through our own Sodom and Gomorrah, it's important that we follow those same navigational tools, our GPS, our altimeter, our flight controls, prayer, Bible study, and fasting. We'll explore that a little bit at the end. For as Christ prayed in his final prayer, he didn't ask us to go to Montana. He didn't ask the Father to take us out of this depraved world. Turn with me you might keep your finger here, we'll be right back, but turn to John 17. We read this each Passover. This is Christ's final prayer. Well, not final prayer, but final public prayer. And in verse 14, it says here in John chapter 17, it says, speaking to the Father, Christ says, I have given them your word, and the world has hated them because they are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. I do not pray that you should take them out of the world, but that you should keep them from the evil one. They are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. Lot, as we saw, was not of his world. He was living there. He was not, I don't want to use that word. He was not of Sodom, and we are not of our world. We are not participating in the moral depravities of this world. Christ understood we would have to live and navigate this world just as Lot did, and prayed to the Father in a sense that we recognize when we get disoriented, that we would have type 2, recognize spiritual spatial disorientation, knowing what is wrong and taking corrective actions, just as we saw Lot do with the angels. Let's continue in the story in verse 4. It says in verse 4, chapter 19 of Genesis, it says, now before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both old and young, all the people of every quarter surrounded the house, that's Lot's house. And they called to Lot and said to him, where are the men that came to you tonight? Bring them out that we may know them carnally. So Lot went out through the doorway and shut the door behind him, and said, please, my brethren, do not do so wickedly. See now, I have 2 daughters who have not known a man. Please let me bring them out to you, and that you may do to them as you wish. Only do nothing to these men, since this is the reason they have come under the shadow of my roof. And they said to him, stand back. Then they said, this one, speaking of Lot, this one came to stay here, and he keeps acting as a judge. Now we'll deal worse with you than with them. And so they pressed hard against Lot and came near to the breaking down the door. And the men, the two angels, reached out their hands and pulled Lot inside the house and shut the door behind them. And they struck the men who were at the doorway of the house with blindness, both small and great. So they became weary to find the door. Don't you think it's interesting? They've been struck with blindness. They're still trying to find the door. All these men, they haven't even, I mean, it's just mind-boggling, the lust, the drive that they had, the blindness that they had to God's way. They were groping for the door until they became too weary to do it anymore. There is so much to unpack here. The depravity of Sodom and Gomorrah is hard to read, and yet, when we compare it to the things going on around us, is it really that hard to believe this world he lived in when we compare it to the world we're living in? Take what's going on with all the abortion activism that's going on around the country. I saw on the news, now it escapes me if it wasn't last night, but the night before, one of the justices was out for dinner. And they found out that he was there. And a crowd surrounded Morton's Steakhouse in downtown Washington, D.C., and were chanting, demanding the judge. He had to sneak out the back door with his security. It's just unbelievable what's going on. And last night I was watching the news, and they were asking the president's press secretary about this, and they were questioning it. What does the president say? And she would not condemn the protesters, would not condemn this behavior. Is our world really that far removed from Lot's world? 3 weeks ago, I think it was 3 weeks ago today, there was a pride parade in St. Petersburg. 300,000 people celebrating depravity in St. Petersburg. No violence, but still, how far removed are we from Sodom and Gomorrah? In all ways, not just in sexual deviation, in all ways, what is happening to our society around us? As a point, we can't even get consensus that a transgender male shouldn't be allowed to compete in female sports. Forget that we're not talking about transgender males. We've gone beyond that into acceptance. Now we're saying they can't compete in female sports. Why is that? Because we don't want to admit that there's a difference between the sexes. That's why we don't do it. I could go on and speak about the specificities of all the depravities that are going on in our society. That would just be venting. We need to recognize that in all of these depravities that we're seeing and all that is going on, this is what type 1, spatial disorientation, spiritual spatial disorientation causes. Remember what type 1 is. It's unrecognized. These people don't recognize that they're disoriented. They're good people, a lot of them, but most of them, very good people. Here, remember, is when a pilot is flying a plane, they think they're doing this. They think everything is right, and the whole time, they could be going up, too, and stalling in midair. God defines spiritual spatial disorientation for us in Proverbs 14, verse 12. You don't need to turn there. I'll just read it to you. You'll know it. It's a memory scripture. Proverbs 14, verse 12 says, "There is a way that seems right to a man, but the ends thereof, death." In this section of Lot's story we just read, among all the disturbing things that you can read in there, there is one particular thing which is not only disturbing, but rather hard to understand. Verse 8, it says, "See now," Lot said to the men, "I have 2 daughters who have not known a man. Please let me bring them out to you, that you may do to them as you wish." What? Say what? I mean, that's what I'd be saying if I were the daughters inside the house. What? How did he come to this? How is it possible that Lot came to saying that to the men? I don't pretend to understand it, nor will I justify it based on the culture of the time and the commentaries that you read that, you know, these men came under the shadow of the roof of his house and he had to do everything he had to do to protect them. I can't get there. What I see here, though, is what can happen to all of us as it happened to Lot. Spiritual, spatial disorientation. Lot is in a storm among the midst of all these men who are trying to get at these other 2 men and now attacking him. He's losing altitude. His brains and eyes are telling him one thing, and yet he's not following his rules. He's plummeting to the earth, and if he's not careful, he's going to take himself and his 2 daughters with him. What we see here, in my opinion, is something that our culture has also adapted to in their navigating the world. It's called situational ethics. Situational ethics is defined as the doctrine of flexibility in the application of moral laws according to circumstances. Let me read that to you again. The application of moral laws according to circumstances. So the moral law says you can't steal, you can't lie, but in this case, situation calls for it. I would say that Lot was being flexible with the moral law when he offered up his daughters. After all, what is the moral law? No greater love has one than to give their own life for another, not their daughters. Now, if you have sons, it could be a little different. They're problematic. While Lot's example is no doubt an extreme example of the application of situational ethics, there is a lesson here for us and how it is connected to this type 1 spiritual spatial disorientation. I would submit to you that our culture today is governed by this principle. It's so blind to the moral laws. As I said in the beginning, when I grew up, everybody had a certain basis in moral laws. Whether they all followed them or not, different story, but there was a common thread that ran through society, at least on the right coast. And people followed it. But today, our whole world is governed by this. Just think, I'll give you 2 quick examples that have been in the news. Of late, President Trump, former President Trump, we found out on January 6, instructed his vice president to break his oath of office and not certify the election, which he felt was rigged and still feels it was rigged. Whether it was rigged or not is not my point. He was asking the vice president to do something. He said, hey, the situation calls for breaking the moral law, breaking your word, breaking your oath, and not certifying the election. The abortion battle is probably even a clearer example of situational ethics. The subjugation of the moral law in favor of the situation. I'm pregnant. Oddly, not too different from the way that Lot was applying the principle in his day, in his time. While these examples are large, the president and the abortion, how is it one can find in themselves spatially disoriented through this principle of situational ethics, making decisions based on the situation, not on the gauges that are telling you you're losing altitude, that the plane is tilting, the plane is going to stall, pull up, pull up. You ignore all of that because the situation calls for you to make your own determination of how to navigate through these dark and turbulent skies. We too, if we're not careful, can find ourselves spiritually, spatially disoriented through the use of the principle that we discuss, situational ethics. Lately, I've been struck by how easy people will, and I'll just give you one example of how this is permeating our society. I've been struck by how easily people will steal and not think twice about it, not even realizing they're stealing. I'll give you 2 examples from mine and then one that you'll recognize yourself that happens every year, or used to happen every year until they changed the rules. A number of years ago, I was buying these cultured concrete blocks. I was doing some gardening at the house. And I bought them, did the work on Sunday, got on an airplane on Monday, I'm flying, and it just hit me that I had paid the wrong amount for the blocks, that they had charged me for the wrong block. So I went back to Home Depot when I got back on Friday, and I said to the young lady, I said, look, you charged me the wrong amount for these blocks. And she said, sir, you've already bought the blocks. There's no way I can know what blocks you bought. That's your price. You have to pay it. And I said, no, young lady, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying you charged me for the cheaper block. I bought the more expensive block, and I need to pay you the difference between the two. Any one of us would do this. And she's just shocked. She says to me, but you got out of the building. What are you doing back? Well, at that point, I had to say, yeah, you're right. See ya. No, I didn't do that. I was in. And you know the way they do it, there's a picture. So they scan a picture of the blocks. That's how they do it. And so I had her open up the book, and I said, you charged me for this? And she could see that. I said, this is the one I bought over here. She calls over the manager. You're not going to believe this knucklehead. He's in here, and he wants to pay us. She couldn't even figure out how to do it, right? Anyhow, it was interesting. Less than a month ago, I had a manager write me an email basically using situational ethics to steal. And he wasn't thinking about stealing, but this was a circumstance in this one. We make foods for other people. So just assume like Campbell's Soups. We make products for the Campbell's Company. And we may have 10, 15 products we make for them. And if they discontinue a SKU, right, they get rid of it, they're obligated to pay us for all the raw material that we've already purchased to make those products, packaging, chocolate, whatever it is we've done. Unless we bought too much. We go out beyond 90 days worth of, just setting the background so you understand this, 90 days worth of raw materials. As it was with the particular customer that discontinued a SKU, we had bought $20,000 too much of a seasoning. And so this man wrote me and he said, listen, we got to mitigate this with them. Let's not tell them it's our fault and have them pay for the $20,000 worth of seasoning. Now, he's a good man. He's not thinking straight. He's spiritually, spatially disoriented. He's saying this is okay. It took me an hour to draft that email so I could tell him gently that was wrong without being overly righteous about it and tell him it was wrong. So those are two examples that I've had, but let me give you a broader example that we all see. You know, you can't return a TV. If you buy a TV today, you can't return it. You know why? Because people were buying TVs to watch the Super Bowl. And then a week later, they would return the TV. Now, that's stealing. If you buy something for a specific use and you return it, that is stealing. The other place this happens frequently, and dealing with Walmart and other places, we talk about stealing all the time because I'm always interested in it, is dresses for proms and for weddings. Women will go in, and I'm not just picking on women, but, well, I mean, today men could wear dresses too, I guess. But I'm not judging Greg. So, you know, they'll buy the dress, they'll wear it to the wedding, then they'll return the dress. That is a form of stealing, right? If you want to rent a dress, go to a rental place and rent a dress. Or if you want to rent a TV, go to Aaron Rents and rent a TV. You don't buy it and return it. That's inappropriate. But that's what's happening. Situational ethics, it's okay. You see, type 1 spatial disorientation is so powerful that while you can see your gauges, and if you've ever been on an airplane while they're loading it and you hear the recordings going on, wind shear, pull up, that you hear these things and you think, oh, they're ignoring those messages, going on believing that in their mind is telling them what is right. That is when you use situations to determine the moral law rather than using the moral law to determine what to do in a situation. You become disoriented. Let's continue in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah and the destruction of the cities, where we'll see type 3, incapacitating spatial disorientation. Remember what this one is. That's when a pilot actually knows he's disoriented. He knows the facts that are in front of him, and yet he's incapacitated for reasons that it could be psychological, physiological, or physical in nature. He cannot change his course. Let's pick up the story in verse 12. It says, then the men said to Lot, have you anyone else here, son-in-law, your sons, your daughters, and whom you have in the city? Take them out of this place, for we will destroy this place because of the outcry against them has grown great before the face of the Lord. And the Lord has sent us to destroy it. So Lot went out and spoke to his sons-in-laws and who had married his daughters. So clearly he has other children here. And said, get up and get out of this place, for the Lord will destroy the city. But his sons-in-law, to his sons-in-law, he seemed to be joking. When the morning dawned, the angels urged Lot to hurry, saying, arise, take your wife, your 2 daughters who are here, and lest you be consumed in the punishment of the city. And while he lingered, type 3, spatial disorientation. He's incapacitated. He knows what's going on. He lingers. So what do the men do? The men took hold of his hand and his wife's hand and the hands of his daughters, and the Lord being merciful to him, and they brought him out and set him outside the city. So it came to pass when they had brought them outside the city, when they had brought them outside, that they said, escape for your life. Do not look behind you, nor stay anywhere in the plain. Escape to the mountains, lest you be destroyed. Then Lot said to them, "Please, no, my lords. Indeed, now your servant has found favor in your sight, and you have increased your mercies, which you have shown me, saving my life. But I cannot escape to the mountain, lest some evil overtake me and I die. See now, this city is near to flee to, and it is a little one. Please let me escape there. Is it not a little one? And my soul shall live." And he said to him, "See, I have favored you concerning this thing also, in that I will not overthrow the city which you have spoken. Hurry, escape there, for I cannot do anything until you arrive there." Therefore the name of the city is Zoar. And the sun had risen upon the earth when Lot entered Zoar. And then the Lord rained brimstone and fire on Sodom and Gomorrah from the Lord out of heaven. So he overthrew those cities, and all the plain, and the inhabitants of the cities, and what was on the ground. But his wife looked back behind him. She became a pillar of salt. Again, she was incapacitated. She couldn't help herself. She had daughters and son-in-laws back there. She couldn't do what she was told to do. She became incapacitated. And finally, in verse 27 through 29, it says that Abraham went out early in the morning to the place where he had stood before the Lord, and looked towards Sodom and Gomorrah, and towards all the land of the plain. And he saw, and behold, the smoke of the land, which went up like a smoke of a furnace. And it came to pass, when God destroyed the cities of the plain, that God remembered Abraham, and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow, when he overthrew the cities which Lot had dwelt. Lot had become incapacitated. Perhaps, we don't know why he was delaying, but perhaps I think it's logical to think he's got children there, maybe grandchildren. Verse 14 says there were sons-in-law and daughters, both plural, which leads to the angels having to take Lot, his wife, and his daughters by the hand and pull them out of the city. This type of spiritual spatial disorientation, this type 3, might be the most dangerous of them all. Remember, type 1 is unrecognized disorientation. Pilot doesn't know what's going on and is making bad choices, and it ends in a crash. In navigating our way through Satan's world, type 1, unrecognized spiritual spatial disorientation, can be, as we have seen ourselves with family members and other extended people that we have known in the church. They become so disoriented that they cannot overcome the pull to do the wrong thing, to go back to the world, as was mentioned in the sermonette. They go back. How can that be? How can they not read their gauges? Type 2, recognized spatial disorientation, as we know, is when a pilot sees what he's doing and overcomes it. Here is where we should be as we navigate this world. We recognize and understand the turbulence we are navigating through by maintaining our course we set when we were at baptism. Corrective actions are taken, baptism, and then repentance, ongoing repentance as we're navigating through this world, and we see that we're becoming disoriented by it. And then this type 3, that we just saw Lot being yanked out, this incapacitating spatial disorientation. In a spiritual sense, it is type 3, this incapacitating spiritual disorientation, that caught Adam and Eve, David in the matter of Uriah the Hittite and the numbering of Israel, Peter denying Christ 3 times, and on it can go. What is the cause of type 3, this incapacitating disorientation? What is the cause? I believe the issue at the core of this, we can see it in the story of Lot. I think we can find it in our own lives. We can find it in the lives of the people we see around us that are incapacitated by it. I think it can be found in 1 John chapter 2. 1 John, if you will, turn there, chapter 2 and verse 15. 1 John chapter 2 and verse 15. He says, "Do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life is not of the Father, but it is of the world. And the world is passing away, and the lust of it. But he who does the will of God abides forever." This world and our time in it is temporary. as it was for Lot. There can be nothing that we put between our Christian walk and that world tomorrow that we're heading for. These three elements, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, can so distort us that while we know what we're doing or what we are about to do is wrong, just like the type 1 pilot, he knows he's disoriented. They still go forward with the disorientation. They're incapacitated. Why? Because they become incapacitated physiologically, the lust of the flesh, psychologically, the lust of the eyes, or physically, the pride of life. These things so incapacitate people and can incapacitate us that while we know what we're doing is wrong and that it is sinning, we continue to go forward. We do not pull up. The lust gets a hold of us, the lust of those men at the door. They were blinded. They couldn't even stop after they were blinded. God may not always choose to physically pull us out of our own incapacitating spiritual disorientation, as he did for Lot. So he instructs us to recognize these potential incapacitations and gives us an antidote to avoid the turbulence and the destruction that results from it in 1 Peter chapter 5. 1 Peter chapter 5, we get the antidote just a couple pages back. 1 Peter chapter 5, and we'll begin in verse 5, but I'm going to break into the middle of the verse. It says, "And be clothed with humility, for God resists the proud. He gives grace to the humble. Therefore humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you in due time, casting all your cares upon him. For he cares for you. Be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary the devil walks about like a roaring lion, seeking those who are incapacitated, that he may devour them." As Christ prayed to the Father, it was not his desire to take us out of the world, but that the Father would keep us from the evil one, and so the Father does. What we have been discussing today is how we navigate through the evil one's world. Oh, if there were only easy answers to that question, a list of things that we could keep in our pocket and look and see how to do it. What we have looked at today are not the list of do's and don'ts in the navigational process, but instead how it is that we become spiritually, spatially disoriented. And rather than holding our course, we vector directly into the heart of the storm, not following the rules of our spiritual flight rules and our spiritual flight training. Remember, John Kennedy was convinced he was flying parallel to the water the whole time he was plummeting the plane straight into the Atlantic Ocean. He was trained and rated as an IFR pilot, but he chose to ignore his training and was tragically lost. So how do we best navigate the evil one's world and avoid vectoring off course? We must renew our spiritual flight rating daily. As I said in the beginning, it's easy. There's prayer. We need to speak to our flight instructor every day. We need to talk to God and talk through the lessons we learned the day before on our flight path, what went right and what went wrong, and how we are going to adjust. There's Bible study. You know, having instruments on a dashboard are great, but if you don't know how to read them and you don't know what they mean and how the tools work, they're of no use. We must know how the instruments work. We must set the moral law ahead of the situation we're in. And then there's fasting. Mike Willie's son-in-law owns a small plane, and if you've ever been in somebody with a small plane, one of the first things they do is they get a little vial, they drain some gasoline into this vial, and they put drops of some liquid in there that tells them if there's water in the fuel, so that you have the energy you need, the plane has the energy it needs, not bad fuel, for making the trip. That's what fasting gives us. While it may weaken us physically, it gives us the strength to make the trip. We need to make sure our fuel is pure. All of what we have looked at today related to flight training is known in aviation as authority bias. Authority bias. That is what to believe when you're navigating in turbulent, dark skies. Do you believe yourself and your gut, or do you believe your training? That's the authority bias. John Kennedy, did not believe his training, and authority bias took his life. Yes, we, like Lot, live in dark and turbulent times, and our world, like his, will end the same, in great tribulation. The only way to navigate Satan's world is not by sight or feel, but by keeping our SFR, our spiritual flight rating, current. That is up to date, daily making sure it is up to date. If we do, someday, others will look back at us and not ask us why we didn't move to Montana, but will say of us, our righteous souls were tormented day by day, seeing and hearing the lawless deeds of this world.